Welcome to the Question Everything podcast. I'm your host, David Dye. Today's conversation is about something most people don't think about until it's too late. What leadership actually looks like when everything breaks down. Because it's easy to talk about leadership when things are working. But what happens when systems fail, when conditions deteriorate, and when people are pushed into survival mode? Today's guest lived through one of the most infamous real world breakdowns in recent memory, the Carnival Triumph Poop Cruise. But instead of focusing on the chaos, she studied what emerged from it. Kim Dooley is an expert in leadership development, and she brings a powerful perspective on how servant leadership shows up, not in theory, but in real world crisis. Because when everything falls apart, that's when leadership is revealed. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction.
Glad you liked it. Now, what actually happened during that experience? The big one with this poop cruise thing.
Well, I think most people are familiar with the Carnival Triumph, and it's one of those things where when everything can go wrong, does all at once. But essentially, when we were out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, we ended up having an issue with an engine fire. And, most people, if you've gone on a cruise before and they do that safety, hey, let's tell you what to do in case, they say one of the worst things that can happen is a fire on a ship. So we're laying in bed one night and it's probably about 4 in the morning. And all of a sudden we hear Alpha, Alpha to the engine room. And you're half asleep and you don't know what's happening, but when you wake up and you don't hear anything, you don't hear any of the background sounds of the air conditioning, or you don't hear any sounds of the engine. It's just silence. So something is going on. You realize that at that moment, you just don't know what it is. And then you start to smell like this burning smell. I'd say smoke, but it smelled more like a burning metal. And so at that point, we didn't know what to do. We were quite afraid at the moment. But then this great British accent voice comes on and says, "Good morning. Everything is fine." And so, and later on, we find out our daughter was our emergency contact. And basically, she gets a phone call that says, "Carnival Triumph, update, there's been a fire on board. No known casualties." And so my daughter's freaking out. Nobody could get in touch with us because we've lost power. And so, of course, any kind of internet and Wi-Fi and all that's not working. And so it was interesting the way people reacted at that point, because Carnival's trying to not make it a big deal so that people stay calm. And so they finally say, "Hey, come on up to the top deck. We're going to have free drinks." And so, of course, that lasted a couple hours. And everybody's like, "It's a party. It's a party going on right here." And so they end up, saying, "We better stop serving them the alcohol because people are getting a little rowdy." And then sort of the reality hits, because people that are, especially in the inside rooms on a cruise, they have no light from the windows. And so that's when I started to see the people that panic and the people that find ways to help others. And that's what I mean when I talk about servant leadership. Instead of being so concerned about me and what I'm going to get, thinking about how I can help. And so, as you would expect, there were really long lines for food. And so, the first people that went through the line, what do you think they did?
Right. Of course, they tried to, grab as much food as they possibly could could
That's
carry. I'm thinking.
exactly right. People hoarded the food. And sometimes we would wait about 3 hours because they had a generator. So they were able to have one hot surface. And so a lot of the food they had to get rid of because they couldn't refrigerate. So it was a lot of like cold cuts and things to make sandwiches. And so my husband kind of waited till the end of the line and he got a piece of bread with an onion on it. So it was
Oh
like, that's
man.
it. Um, but the other thing that happened is people, the good things that started to happen is people had to trust each other. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, but essentially, you know, people were trying to make sure that they had their basic necessities. And so that's when coordination and servant leadership happened because there were people with babies that were running out of formula and diapers or trying to have enough medicine because you planned on a 3-day trip and it ended up being a full week by the time we got back into Mobile. So kind of these coordinators, I called my husband, he became McGuire, what's the show? Oh, this, I can't think of the name right now. Like he was the one that was trying to solve all the problems.
Mm-mm.
MacGyver, that's
Okay,
it.
okay.
He became MacGyver, if you remember that show.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they started coordinate things. And so one of the things they noticed is that because the ship was under, a Norwegian flag or something. It had European, the large outlets and stuff. And so because there was a generator, you could see that the cash registers, like especially how they have the casinos on there, the cash registers were still lit up. And so it was like, so they turned it around and saw that there were ports, right? And so the USB ports could be used to charge a phone. And so they started doing these charging stations, and people would come up, and I didn't know where my husband was. I thought he was lost on the ship. And then I find him, and he's got all these people saying, "Hey, can I come at 1?" And I was like, "Come where? What's happening?" And he's like, well, we figured out that we could help people charge their phones because whenever a ship would come close by and bring us some food, you could get a Wi-Fi and they could reach out to their family and tell them what was happening. And so they were also having to use those for flashlights because people didn't think to bring flashlights. So keeping your cell phone charged was an essential need. And so that became beyond the food and access to restrooms, which became a very large problem that wasn't easy to solve because the ship, when you have no power, the whole flushing systems wouldn't work. And so you've got what, 4,000 people or so, and trying to find restrooms that flushed. And after a while, none of them did. They were all overflowing. And so the ship, we were lucky because we were on the side of the ship. It started listing, right? So we're on the side of the ship that's up. And so we don't have any water in our room. And their solution, and I'll say the people working on the cruise were fantastic. They were working night and day, trying to do everything they could. So they basically said, and I'm just going to say the word, pee in your shower. And they gave us biohazard bags. So you just kind of put that biohazard bag in your trash can, and then you would poop in that, and then put the bags out in the hall, and the stewards would come and pick them up. So it's a whole new meaning to a biohazard bag, but it was, probably the best solution at the time. Um, so we were doing that. And then the ship, because it had no power, it listed the other way.
So that means the ship leaned over to
It
one side.
leaned the other way because it didn't have a stabilizer. And when it did
Right.
that, all of that sewage water, then our carpets were wet with the sewer water.
Oh,
And
ugh.
at one time, my husband and I were laying in the bed with our hands over our chest, and we felt just like we were in that Titanic scene. We didn't want to touch the ground, and we knew the end was near. But of course, it wasn't that bad. But So people started creating a city on the top deck. This was warm enough because we were still out in the Gulf. And so people, we called it a tent city. You know, they would take the lounge chairs and then they'd have sheets over it. And because at least they had some air coming through and they had a little bit of light during the day. And so there were tent cities that started, especially for those in the inside rooms. And so because we were on a balcony room, because we were with other friends, and so you could get the balcony and you can take the dividers down. So we had this big balcony. And so a lot of times we were sleeping out there on that balcony. But the thing about Maslow's is that nobody was really worried about their possessions at that point, because we needed food, water, shelter, and space. So what we started doing is taking the people that were on the inside rooms and say, come over here with us. We have a balcony, so you can be a little more comfortable. And so we just started inviting strangers into our space because we realized that the crew couldn't do everything. And so between trying to find diapers and trying to find formula and medicine and making sure the people that were not physically able to go to the top deck to get food, people that were in a wheelchair, they couldn't use the elevators. And so that was another need that we recognized. And so we started making sure people were helping those that couldn't get to the top deck, bringing them food and helping them. And of course, the restroom situation, there wasn't a lot we could do with that. Um, and so that's how it got its famous name as the Poop Cruise or Urine Town or whatever, But basically talking about the leadership that emerged from that, what impressed me the most was people taking care of strangers. So one time when we were in the line waiting for the food that people were hoarding, there was a man that looked really desperate and he was wearing a carnival robe and he had a child with him. So I'm guessing grandfather maybe. And he just looked like he needed help. So I just said, "Can I help you with anything?" And he said, "Will you watch my granddaughter? Would you let her stand with you in line?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so I realized later the reason he was in nothing but a carnival robe, he was in the process of washing clothes when all this happened. And so that listing caused all of that sewage to also come up into the washing machines. And so he had nothing. And a lot of people by the end had nothing but those carnival robes. If you've seen those pictures of people, leaving the ship, kissing the ground, they're all wearing the carnival robes. And it also got cooler. So I want to talk a little bit about the solution and, not to belittle the company, but I think in some ways they really had a PR issue and they tried to make things look better than they were. And so that's why I say the crew was fantastic. But they essentially, when we were out at sea, we had drifted off 100 miles off. And so, because of that, originally they thought, well, we'll bring you into Progreso, Mexico. But not everybody even had passports and things. But we had drifted so far off, so they decided to call in these tugboats. And so the tugboats, I mean, with a big cruise ship, I mean, those tugboats were working as hard as they could, but we were like going, so slowly. But they made the decision instead of bringing us back to Galveston, where all our cars were in Texas, we ended up, they took us to Mobile, Alabama. And the reason is that in Mobile, that's where they have their ship repairs. So I think they made that decision because even though they had to transport everybody from Mobile back to Galveston, because that's where our cars were, that way the ship would be where it needed to be. And so I think that, that decision was made, I think, more in benefit of the company than it was for the people on board. The other thing that happened, it was right around Valentine's Day. So of course, we're on there um, an extra 5 days. And so we've been, like I said, just kind of eating whatever we could. Other ships would bring in food. And it's amazing that nobody got sick, foodborne illness, really, considering. But for Valentine's Day, all of a sudden, we have steak and lobster. And that's when the cameras were there, like somehow they got on the ship. And these people are fine.
How
And so there
convenient.
were a few publicity things like that that I think made the general public not understand the severity of the situation. But I know, as a company, they probably were trying to prevent others from saying, I'm never going to cruise again. And they did give us free pictures, and they gave us a free cruise we could use in the future. Nobody in my group took them up on that.
Not surprised. I did think about that as you said. As soon as you said that, I was like, do you want to do this again?
Well, the good thing about getting to a place when you're on vacation and staying there is you're on solid ground. You're not out in the middle of the ocean. And I'm a really great swimmer and I love to snorkel and scuba dive and everything. And there were a few times I was looking at the shore wondering if I could swim in, but of course not. But miraculously, I think there was one person on the ship that had to be flown out for health reasons. And considering, the amount of sewage basically everywhere on the floors and things, I think it's just amazing that people did not get sick. Because can you imagine adding that element? Then everybody, having diarrhea and throwing up, and it would have even been worse. So that was a miracle. But that servant leadership of taking care of strangers, making sure the woman in the wheelchair had food and was taken care of, watching someone else's child or grandchild, for them to wait in line. So they had someone they trusted to leave their child with. Think about that. People would never do that normally, but you had to trust because you knew, you know, there were people there that were more concerned about each other. And I think it's just because I looked him in the eyes and I said, what do you need? And that's all it took is, instead of hoarding the food to say, hey, let's make sure everybody is just taking a small amount and we'll be fine. We'll be fine. So it was very interesting.
I can imagine. Now, what was it that surprised you the most about how people reacted, on the cruise when this calamity struck?
And that's the thing. I mean, there were people taking their sheets and doing SOS, and whenever the a helicopter or something would go by, save me, save me. There was the typical, hey, this is my moment of fame. But what surprised me the most really was the fact that um, the notion of us not worrying about any of our belongings because that was not important anymore. The thing that was more important was making sure people were safe and people were taken care of. And that's the part of it that I loved the most that you didn't see in the Netflix series, and they showed a few families and that was their story. But my story is how that servant leadership emerged out of that wreckage, and to think about how human kindness is still, I mean, it's the most important thing. And sometimes we lose sight of that because we're so worried about my discomfort that I'm just going to complain instead of saying, okay, you know, I have a balcony. You can come in our room and get some fresh air and or I have, a contact of someone that has extra formula. Let's get you matched up. And those things, everybody was trying that was not being self-centered. Everybody that was showing servant leadership was helping each other. I mean, even someone was like, I really need a Diet Coke. Well, let's see if we can find a Diet Coke. And we would kind of go and try to get into spaces to see if we could find things. I mean, even simple needs like that weren't really life or death, just something that would bring someone comfort. And that's one of the things that I think people needed the most. Once we knew we weren't going to die, it wasn't dire. And you start to say, yeah, I'm inconvenienced, but what can we do to make this better for others? And that's a part of it that was really special. The group that I was with was actually from my church, and we all sang in the choir at church, and many of us play instruments. And so at one point, in the promenades, a lot of people were walking along those promenades, and there was a piano. And so we all just gathered around the piano, and one member started playing, and we just started singing hymns that we knew. And it was amazing. Like all these people just started coming up to the piano and singing with us. And it was just like this community. All of a sudden, we had a community just around that piano of taking refuge, and I think about some of the hymns, like we sang Amazing Grace and through many dangers, toils, and snares, and it was just kind of like we put ourselves contextually into that hymn at that moment. And it was a very powerful moment. Probably my favorite moment and most surprising moment was being around the piano and singing.
Now, what do you think separates people who step up to the challenge from those who just shut down and yeah, cower into, selfishness or fear, those types of things?
Well, I think people that have not experienced a lot of, trauma or, nothing like this has ever happened to them, they don't really know how to react. And I think many times those are the people that are going to have the most fear. I mean, naturally, right? But as you've lived longer on this planet and you've been in other situations, like I was saying, my book, When Life Misses a Note, I talk about all these crazy things that have happened to me and having to have emergency surgery in Lima, Peru, and you realize that, the most important thing is not fear in that moment, because fear is going to keep you from doing anything. You have to befriend your fear. And you have to find that place where you're brave and that you're seeking ways to help the situation be better. And it takes bravery. And if you've never really been in an experience, and say you're a young adult or a teenager, and this is your first cruise and this happens to you, I mean, I'm sure, they were panicked and they were, what do we do? I can't use my phone, but when you realize, okay, you don't have your phone, well, what do we have? And you become a problem solver. And that's really what happened is like, oh, if there's light on this cash register, there's power somewhere. And so it takes that ability to say, okay, I've got to think differently. I've got to look for ways to solve the problem. And I think a lot of that's probably when you have more experience with life situations, and this isn't your first, as we say in Texas, rodeo, you're probably more apt to know how to handle that than someone that's never had those experiences. And now I'm not a researcher on, psychology or something to know that, but I would just say that would be my hunch of probably why. And the other thing I would say is just how people today, I would just say something I notice is that there are people today that don't care about anybody else but themselves. That's all they care about. And the other night we were just driving home from we're part of the Opera and Performing Arts Society, and we were having our launch for the next season. And where I live, it's called College Station. So there's a train right through our campus. And so we were in a lane, and when the train's there, you can't get across. So we were trying to change lanes. And one car turned to the left. And so we finally, had our blinker on, tried to get over, and the car behind them sped up and just started honking and yelling at us and stuff. And then, of course, zoomed around us and got beside us and rolled down their window and showed us all kinds of nice signs with their fingers. And so we were just like going, wow. I mean, and if we were in that situation and someone had their blinker on, we would let them get into the lane. And so, what makes us different from that person? He felt inconvenienced because we were trying to change lanes. And we were just in his way and he was going to run us over. I mean, And why is a person like that? Because think about all the stress they hold in their heart. There's got to be a better way. My daughter always says, I think counseling's cheaper, you know. But honestly, and so what makes somebody a kind and considerate person? And it's partly our moral compass. And I mean, I've done things like that. I've lost my patience on the road, and I've had road rage. I'm not saying I'm a perfect person. We probably all have had those days, but then when you look back and you go, really? You know, you got so angry about this one little thing. And, so our just in general humanity needs to take a chill pill and think more about why am I so angry? And so now that I'm a life coach, I retired as a professor and I'm a certified transformational life coach. And one of the things I do is I work with people on trying to help them if they're have longing and discontent, they're frustrated with their job, or they've gone through a divorce, or they've lost a loved one, and they're going through this time where it's almost like an identity crisis. They just don't know who they are without that job or without that person. And so I try to help people visualize a future that they would love. What are you doing? What is your purpose? What is your passion? What are you doing for a life that you would love? And what it does is it shifts those constricting thoughts, those angry thoughts, to positive thoughts. And I know it sounds simple, and you say, positivity, you know, it's true. If you're always thinking about, I don't have enough time, I'm just so stressed out, and you feel the stress in your body. If I said, man, if I had a perfect day, I would be at the beach and I'd be with my friends, we'd be drinking wine. Your body calms down automatically because you're thinking about this happy place. And so that's a lot of what we do in transformational coaching is help people to think more expansive, to think about what it is they love and trying to move them toward a vision of that so they become that vision. And so I've seen a lot of people struggle with anger management. And, I think you have a choice. And something happened to me professionally that really upset me. And the day that it happened, I had been doing the coaching and getting certified. And at the moment, there was something I was asked to do, and all of a sudden they said, we don't need you. And so I thought about it. I thought at first I just wanted to, just kind of fight for my rights. But I realized, I said, now I have this time that I can do something else that I love. So instead of getting angry about it, I just said, this was then, this is now. What do I have control over? This is now. So, that's a long answer to say, people, I can't motivate someone to change. They have to want to change. But what we think impacts how we feel and what actions we take. So by changing your thinking, you can change your actions. And I think that's what makes the difference. People that have that kind of emotional intelligence to just realize that, hey, this is not a big deal. I might be 2 minutes behind where I wanted to be on my commute, but in the big scheme of things, was that worth? And I think when he looked in the car and saw, my husband and I, my daughter in there, I think he felt bad because then really he slowed down and he wouldn't come beside us anymore because we didn't react. We didn't react. We could have. I could have rolled down my window and done a few signs of my own, but why? So we just didn't react. And I think when he looked in there so angry, he was just like, oh, this is a family. And maybe I shouldn't have done that. Or at least that's what I hope he thought, because maybe next time he'll realize that was that really worth it? Because it didn't bother them at all. They never even looked at me, but I sure got a lot of rage. And all I did was hurt myself, not them. So you see what I mean? It's all a mindset. And I'm really big on growth mindset. We should be learning new things every day, trying new things every day, continue to grow all the time.
I agree 100%. Now, I mean, that was wonderful. With everything you said, you just tied so many things together and wrapped it all up and brought it all in. Now, a question I had about getting back to the cruise is, um, I think some people might have thought that the crew, didn't exhibit leadership, but I'm not sure I believe that. Do you think that the crew exhibited a lot of leadership, or did a lot of the crew, I mean, a lot of the passengers also exhibit, a lot of leadership as well?
Oh yeah, the crew on the ship with us, they were doing everything they possibly could. Everything. But there were so few of them compared to us. And so that's when certain individuals realized, we can do things too. But no, I have nothing but praise for the crew, on the cruise that day. They were working so hard. And, can you imagine having to be the one to get the biohazard bags out of the out of the hallway, right? I mean, they were working so hard trying to get food and trying to have clean water for us and, trying to find solutions the whole time. So I wouldn't say that there wasn't leadership there, but when you think of leaders and being a student of leadership, I say this, sometimes we look at leadership as positional power. Who is CEO of the Carnival Cruise Lines, right? But that person wasn't on the ship with us, right? And they were trying to do damage control. But a lot of times, leaders are the people we follow. And so it was the people on the cruise themselves that became situational leaders in that moment. And whether they wanted to be a leader or not, they were. And people needed direction. So, our very happy British, cruise director getting on the PA all the time and just as happy and cheerful as she could be. She didn't feel that way. But she didn't want us to panic. She was a leader in that moment, because she was giving us updates, but she wasn't giving us updates with a doom and gloom. She was giving us updates, we're asking for you to do this and this will really help. I mean, and so people were like, yes, we're going to do whatever you say. So she became, a leader in that situation. So I think the leaders on the cruise definitely were doing everything they could. I just think that in general, I mean, if you're not on board and going through that experience, it's hard for you to understand as a leader on the outside what should be done, and so you're making decisions, as many CEOs have to. You're making economic decisions. We're going to go to Mobile because then we can get the ship repaired, which I can't believe they repaired it and got it back out again. I was like, you need to just sink that ship, but anyway. But they, revamped it and it's back on the seas as far as I know. I heard someone say. But, they made that decision because that was the best thing for the company. But then they have to transport us all. So we had buses, taking us back to Galveston. And when we would stop at a rest stop, There were people in Mobile bringing us food and bottles of water. I mean, there was like this caravan of people making sure that our needs were met along the way. And all those volunteers, they became leaders in the situation. They saw a need and they were like, okay, we're gonna we're gonna be at the rest stop when they stop, and we've got Chick-fil-A and we've got all this stuff. They didn't have to do that. So, we were taken care of all the way back to our vehicles, and those decisions had to be made by someone at a higher level. And those were great decisions too. Um, maybe that was the only decision they could make. I don't know, but I thought it was just interesting that they would have had to, I guess, dry dock the ship somewhere else and somehow get it to Mobile versus us being let off at Galveston, which was closer. So it meant a few, extra days. So, I don't know. I wasn't in the corporate side of that to know what was the best decision. But I would say, yeah, leadership emerged everywhere, even in the communities along the road when we're traveling back to Galveston. And a renewal in mankind, because of people all wanting to help. And it was a novelty, a lot of people were like, ooh, let's go and see these poor people in their carnival robes. I'm sure some people were just curious, but I think they were there more so to serve us and help us to get home. And Alabama did a great job with that. And I think we also had a rest stop in Louisiana that was the same thing, getting back to Texas. So there were leaders everywhere.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I have a question now. Do you think that systems create leaders or expose them?
That's an interesting question. You know, from my perspective, I really love to see how leadership emerges, like we're talking about things like transformational leaders or servant leaders. If you look at positional power or title, one of the things that typically happens is someone that's really good at something, like at a university, you're a really great researcher, so you become an administrator. And the skill sets are totally different. Just because you've won all these awards as a researcher doesn't mean you know how to work with people. And so what you see is a lot of leaders that are promoted because of something they did well in the job, not necessarily because of their skill set as a leader. And so I don't know how to answer your question, because I think you could say, are leaders with certain traits, or is it learned? And for me, I believe a lot of the things we know about leadership are learned. Now, I may have a charismatic personality, I may be a good communicator, I may be a person that wants to co-create with others and not take the credit. Some of that might be my personality, but the actual leadership, if you say trait theory versus what is learned, I think we learn by having leaders that aren't so great. And we realize that I would never do that. That's not the kind of leader I would be. And I've lost jobs because of that, because I'm too nice or I care too much about the people that I work with. I want to build a team and they need to be told what they're supposed to do and they need to quit doing these things and you need to straighten this place up. And, I believe that the way you do that is from the whole group, not a leader telling you what you need to do. So, you know, the leader the leader within us is there for everyone, but some people get the opportunities because of other things to be a positional leader and have a title. And I hope what they do is learn how to do it well, because it can be learned. So, but someone that's a researcher or someone like my brother, he's retired from NASA. And one time NASA said, we're going to make our astronauts the leaders. We're going to promote them to be the administrators. It was awful, because what astronauts do, and they do very well, I mean, they're scientists and they're problem solvers, but they don't necessarily want to deal with HR and all these things that make the organization run. They don't want to have to build a vision. I've got my own vision. I'm going to the moon or I'm going to Mars. So sometimes we think the leaders are the ones that are the closest to the situation of the organization, and yet those people don't have the right skills to be a good leader. They might be a manager, but not a leader. So that's what I've recognized. And I've had some leaders that always took the credit, and the staff would do everything. And then, they would be in the bar drinking a beer, and then they'd come in and just, wow, I'm here. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I want to make sure everybody's recognized. I want to make sure everybody has a part to play. And I learned that from having leaders that didn't always do what I thought should be done. And it goes back to your emotional intelligence. So anyway, that's what I
Right.
think. That's my opinion.
Okay, okay, okay. I think we agree on a lot of different things. I've dealt with a number of different uh, leaders or managers or people with a title versus actual leader, and I do believe there's a difference, between someone who got conferred a leadership position through a title versus a person that actually exhibits leadership and gets people, aligned with doing different things for the organization. Now, in that spirit, I want to ask you, what beliefs about leadership do most people have wrong, in your opinion?
Well, I think that people that haven't really studied leadership just assume that a leader is the person in charge. And I think that's what most people think. They just associate with whoever's in charge as the leader. But we know that that's not necessarily the truth, because usually in an organization that might have a very autocratic leader, usually there's someone else within the organization that everybody goes to for that advice, or how can I do this? And that person is actually the leader because all these people are following them. And so I just think that people, and that person that's doing that doesn't even recognize themselves as a leader. And I can remember really early in my career as a professor, the student, as she had come from Cornell, and she said, I want to interview you for a leadership paper. And I was like, I'm not a leader. Why do you want to interview me? And she goes, oh, I look up to you as a woman professor in the College of Ag and Life Sciences. You're my role model. And so that was when I realized that some people see us as a leader and we don't see ourselves as that. And that's what I think happens. People just say, oh yeah, our leader is our boss. But who's following them? They might be afraid of them and they might do stuff to comply, but are they really following them? That's a question, because you're not a leader if no one's following you.
Very true, very
So a
true.
lot of people in my profession also study followership, which is its own area of research. And so that's what's really important in all settings, to realize that, there are certain traits or characteristics of a leader, and some people will follow them because that it's charismatic, or they believe the same way and they think that's what should be done, and they'll follow them for that reason, and not ever believe that that person did anything wrong. And yet, when things are pointed out, oh no, that's fake news, that's not true. And so there are people that will blindly follow leaders, and they're that's another situation, that they just follow them because they're the leader and not because they necessarily have values that everybody believes in. So that happens too. People blindly follow.
So, in that vein, what do you think that everyday people can learn from your experience on that fateful cruise?
I think everyday people should just realize that whenever you're in a tough situation, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be poop cruise. When you're in a situation, if you would just stop, and honestly, this sounds so simple, but we do this in conflict management too. Stop, take a breath, and count to three. And most of the time, that will cause you to react differently than you would if you instantaneously reacted. And so it gives you a chance to put it in perspective. It gives you a chance to kind of calm down a little bit. And usually, once we calm down those emotions, we can think more rationally about, what should happen in the situation and become the problem solver instead of making the problem worse. And I think that would prevent people a lot of fights. And I was associate dean for academic operations at one point, and I had to work with students who had flunked out of college, and kicking them out. That was not a fun job. But one of the things that I learned is that if I could separate them as a person from their grades, yes, you made some bad decisions. And so as a result, this is happening, but that's not who you are. You have an opportunity to go and learn from that and do something, different, do something better, go to another institution. Don't go back to college, start a business or do some, so it's not you. And I think that's what happens. So many people can't separate the situation from who they are as a person. And so if that's happening to them, they're going to react as if the whole world is on fire. And so I think for everyday people, you want to have a little more balance in your life, a little more joy in your heart. Just give yourself a moment to take a deep breath and count to three and start to think about how you would solve a problem instead of contribute to the problem. And you're going to find yourself feeling more confident and more just joyful because then you're helping other people instead of only thinking about yourself.
Excellent answer. Now, in your opinion, do you think we are prepared for failure scenarios in modern society?
No, I don't. I think that um, and there's a lot of directions I could go with this, but I think what I'll say is that generations, I love looking at different generations. And of course, we're defined by usually a major historical event in our generation. But, if you look at the youth today, I believe we have a great future. But what happened in past generations is the parents started, and I'm not dogging parents, but I'm just saying parents started just solving all their kids' problems for them. And so even, parents started going to job interviews with their college student and things like that. And how will they ever be able to solve their own problems if you're always solving them for them? And so, I think that some of our generations, they've just been babied so much that they don't know how to launch. And, I'm a baby boomer. So, I mean, we were like thrown out of the house at first thing in the morning, and we came back when the lights turned on the street, and we drank out of the water hose, and we didn't have helmets. And, it was survival of the fittest for us. And so maybe that's part of why I have that viewpoint. But I just think it's important that we don't, you know, solve every problem for our children because then that generation doesn't know how to solve problems. And so without that, I mean, I taught an adult education class. So I had college students and I had them do an adult education inventory. And one of the students says, I can't do this. I was like, well, just answer to the best of your knowledge. She goes, no, my mom still gets my prescriptions for me. And I was like, okay. So adulthood is not by age. It's really about responsibility. And so, if you don't take on some of the responsibility for your own life, You may be a 40-year-old child still, that your parents still do everything for you. And I think that I think you need to cut those apron strings and go do things for yourself. Um, and I know there's differences because I have one daughter that was very independent, and we did all that with her when she was in college. We started cutting the bills so she would take more responsibility. So by the time she graduated from college, she was taking care of everything. And then I had another daughter that, she'd be in a job and the store would close, and then she would have to go find another job. And then it was just like, we had to help her more. So I'm not saying you just kind of cut them off and leave them in the street. As a parent, we wouldn't do that. But trying, sometimes we need to scaffold that love for them. And so eventually saying, okay, what is your decision? How would you do this? Hey, you need a new car, you're in a wreck. What are you going to do? And having her making those decisions, and while they still kind of have a safety net. But yeah, I see a lot of that. And some of the younger generations with their parents being just so much in their life. They talk to their parents every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I understand where it comes from because you just want the best for your kids. You want to help them as much as you can.
Oh,
But
yeah.
at a certain point, the help kind of turns into a handicap if you kind of overextend and
It
don't
becomes
allow them.
enabling. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I was accused of that one time with a friend of mine that was getting a divorce. And I kept saying, my house is your safe haven, and I probably needed to help her make her own decisions instead of just, you know, here, come stay at my house. And you don't know that at the time because you think you're doing what's best for that person. And so, yeah, I mean, I totally get it because when we love someone, we'll do anything for them. But you have to kind of let them figure it out when they can do it for themselves. And that's hard.
Yes, it can be. Now, where
I
can
probably get
people
hate
learn?
mail
Hmm?
now because I said parents were babying their kids too much.
It's like everything else. It's like a continuum, I believe.
It is, and it depends on the child and their own, abilities to be independent, So some need more of that scaffolding than others. Others,
mm,
I told my kids, you're going to college, don't come home for a month. Go and make some friends and all of this stuff because, if she'd come home every weekend, she's not really getting, and so I say instead of being a helicopter parent, I was a slingshot parent. I was like, "Hey, you're gone."
Get out, man.
But she turned out okay.
Good, good. Now, where can people learn more about your work?
Well, I have a website, my company that I'm the CEO of. It's called the Tech Training Group. And so the website is TECH, word training, word group.com. So it does have two G's because training at the end and group. And so Tech Training Group, spelled out, TECH traininggroup.com. On that page, you'll find out a little bit more about our services. We do training and development. We're certified training professionals. So we do a lot of contract work there. We're also evaluators on projects. So we go in and do evidence-based decision making and evaluations from needs assessment all the way to continuous improvement. And so we do that over contract. And then I recently added the life coaching, transformational life coaching. So the coaching is on there as well. So that's training, evaluation, coaching. And then the H is harnessing human potential. The other thing coming up for me, I have a book in pre-launch. I mentioned it early, When Life Misses a Note. And there is a link under our resources at the bottom for the book if you're interested in signing up during the pre-launch. We're in the copyright stage right now, so it should be out this summer. So you can get to me there. And then one last thing I would say, if you'd like to set up an appointment with me, I also have a Calendly on the tech group. And you just have to click on that and it'll give you access to my calendar and it'll set us up a 30-minute meeting if you'd like to know more.
Excellent, excellent. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to give your assessment and your experience with this infamous cruise and also all your and also all your wisdom on leadership and how people can, improve their lives.
Thank you. It's really critical. We need good leaders. We need leaders within our ranks, and we need people to lead more happy and joyful lives and not get so stressed out. And so I think the leader sets the culture for an organization. And so if we have leaders that are willing to grow and learn and find out what the people they lead need and want, we would have much better organizations. And so I think leadership is key.
So thank you again for appearing on the Question Everything podcast. That was wonderful.
Thank you.